October 14th, 1854. Captain James Luce has just arrived in Quebec. For the last 17 days, he has suffered a grueling ordeal. Despite being hungry, thirsty, cold, and exhausted, his first thoughts are for his employer, Edward Knight Collins, owner of the Collins Line. Captain Luce was, until 17 days ago, the captain of the SS Arctic, and he has news that no person ever wishes to deliver. He writes, "Dear Sir, it becomes my painful duty to inform you of the total loss of the Arctic under my command, with many lives. And I fear among them must be included your own wife, daughter, and son, of whom I took a last leave the moment the ship was going down, without ever expecting to see the light of another day to give you an account of the heart-rending scene." The SS Arctic, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. With rare exception, the stories told on this podcast describe terrible maritime tragedies and loss of life, and I don't take this lightly. Describing the deaths of so many is often difficult, even long after the events took place, and I am reminded to treat these tales with respect. But sometimes, as was the case with the wreck of the Batavia, the details are so shocking and disturbing that it gives me pause, and I begin to almost feel the panic, fear, and suffering. This is one of those stories. The history of transatlantic travel dates back, according to legend, to the 6th century CE, when an Irish monk named St. Brendan made the crossing in a small, crude vessel called a curragh. He documented his tale himself, and the book became a medieval bestseller. It isn't the most reliable historical practice to take an autobiography as fact, but we have no way of proving or disproving this tale. We do have fairly solid evidence that Norseman Leif Erikson reached modern-day Canada, naming this land Vinland after the vast greenery he encountered. Most, but not all, historians agree on this. But Erikson didn't settle there, and he abandoned the area a short time later. It wasn't until the expedition of Christopher Columbus in 1492 that we can say with absolute certainty that the Atlantic had been crossed by ship. This ignited the age of exploration and then the age of sail, opening up new trade, colonization, and of course, conflicts. Sailing ships dominated the oceans for the next 350 years, including the juggernaut fleets of Great Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Steam engines were invented by Scotsman James Watt in 1769, and by the early 1800s, steam-powered vessels were on the rise. The first ever steam-powered vessel to cross the Atlantic was the American ship SS Savannah, taking just short of 30 days to make the voyage. While a tremendous feat, only 11% of that time used her steam engines, with the bulk of the propulsion coming from her sails. In 1838, the British vessel SS Great Western became the first ship to provide regularly scheduled transatlantic passenger service. She had a groundbreaking design by the legendary British engineer and ship designer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. With steamships now transporting passengers across the Atlantic, the British Admiralty desired to establish a transatlantic mail service as well, and offered a contract for £50,000 annually to the successful bidder. In 1839, Samuel Cunard was granted the contract to provide regularly scheduled transatlantic mail service at the offered rate. But the contract came with significant penalties: £500 a day for arriving late, £15,000 for a canceled trip. Cunard agreed to these terms, undercutting other bidders who were attaching many demands. Cunard, a Canadian born to American parents, accepted the contract, despite owning no ships and without any financing. Nevertheless, Cunard's newly formed British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, a marketing mouthful, became the first regularly scheduled transatlantic mail service in history. Cunard forged ahead, acquired financing, and in 1840 launched the first of 4 sister ships, the RMS Britannia. The ship carried mail and passengers between Liverpool, Halifax, and Boston. Soon after, American sentiment began growing for the United States to subsidize American ships to carry its mail across the ocean. Speaking before Congress, U.S. Senator James A. Bayard delivered a passionate plea. America will soon become tired of being informed of British maritime supremacy. I suggest that Congress grant a carefully selected American shipping expert a completely free hand to proceed with the absolute conquest of this man, Cunard. By 1845, the United States Postal Service requested bids from American ship owners to provide its own transatlantic mail service. That contract was awarded to Edward Knight Collins in 1847, and he subsequently formed the New York and Liverpool United States Mail Steamship Company, which was more commonly referred to as the Collins Line. The company was guaranteed to receive a yearly subsidy of $385,000 a year, more than $14 million in today's money. He began building a fleet of 4 ships, the Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic, and Baltic. The new Collins Line ships were built in New York City on the East River by the William H. Brown Shipbuilding Company. The Arctic, the third of the sister ships to be built, was launched in January of 1850. She was 2,856 tons, 284 feet long, had a beam of 46 feet, and 2 large paddle wheels, 35.5 feet in diameter, on both sides of her hull. Her 2 1,000 horsepower steam engines allowed her to reach speeds exceeding 12 knots, and she also had 3 masts fitted with square-rigged sails, although her mizzenmast, or rear mast, was removed in 1852. Her total construction cost was $700,000, or about $28 million in 2023 dollars. Just for the record, the most expensive cruise ship ever built by the end of 2022 is Royal Caribbean's Allure of the Seas at $1.43 billion. The Arctic and her 3 sister ships would all be put in service before the end of 1850. On October 26, 1850, there was quite a celebration as the Arctic set out on her maiden voyage. Collins, never a man to miss a promotional opportunity, brought in the Atlantic to give even more thrills to the estimated 20,000 dazzled spectators. The Arctic departed on her New York to Liverpool run with experienced Captain James Luce in command. The voyage was smooth and trouble-free. In February of 1852, the Arctic made the Liverpool to New York run in only 9 days and 17 hours, winning her the Blue Riband for that year. In honor of her speed, she earned the nickname the Clipper of the Seas. But she was not only fast, she was incredibly luxurious. The Arctic carried passengers in 2 classes, a very lavish first class named the Saloon Class, with grand dining halls, lounges, and a barbershop and hair salon. It even featured the modern luxuries of steam heating and running water. Second class was not quite as extravagant, but still very comfortable and much nicer than had been common for passenger liners of the time. Harper's New York Monthly magazine gave her a glowing review, writing, "If you ever wish to cross the Atlantic, you will find in the Arctic one of the noblest of ships, and in Captain Luce, one of the best of commanders." In comparison, Charles Dickens wrote of his travels on the RMS Britannia, "A thoroughly hopeless and profoundly preposterous box," describing the saloon as a long, narrow apartment, not unlike a gigantic hearse. After all, the Americans were trying to outcompete and outclass their British rivals at Cunard. The Arctic and her sister ships were the stars of the seas in the early 1850s, but the Arctic experienced 2 near disasters during that time. In November of 1853, she ran aground on Burbo Bank while incoming at Liverpool Bay. She was refloated and taken back to Liverpool for repairs. Then in May of 1854, while on voyage from Liverpool to New York, she collided with the Black Rock off the coast of the Saltee Islands in County Wexford, Ireland. Once again, she returned to Liverpool for repairs. At this time, the ship's engines were modified in order to make them more coal efficient, as costs were significantly eating into profits. Her new engines were developed by the Weathered Brothers firm out of Baltimore, and it was believed these new engines would cut fuel costs in half. But in fact, these new engines put a tremendous amount of stress on the ship's hull. On September 13, 1854, the Arctic arrived in Liverpool after an uneventful voyage from New York, where passengers disembarked and its cargo of American cotton was unloaded. For its return run to New York, she would host a number of VIPs, including the wife of Edward Collins, Mary, and their two children, 19-year-old Mary Ann and 15-year-old Henry. Also on board were 6 members of the Brown banking family who had provided financial backing to the Collins line. Antoine Agenot, the Duc de Gramont, who was also traveling to America as the new French ambassador, and Captain Luce's 11-year-old son, William Robert, who went by the name Willie. The boy was partially disabled, and Luce thought the round-trip voyage would be therapeutic for him. In total, there were approximately 233 passengers on board, with about 150 of them being first class, and roughly 100 of the passengers were women and children. Additionally, the ship carried 150 crew. The Arctic departed Liverpool on September 20, 1854. All was well aboard the Arctic at the start of the voyage. Passengers in both classes reveled in the lavish accommodations. They enjoyed fine meals and mingled in the lounges. On the 21st of September, the Arctic passed Cape Clear at the southern tip of Ireland and entered the open Atlantic. The weather was calm and the seas smooth. It is significant to point out at this time the financial straits of the Collins line. The Arctic's speed and comfort did come at a price. The hungry steam engines required an extraordinary amount of coal, and the numerous repairs required to the line's 4 ships was proving difficult. For these reasons, the Collins line was struggling to be profitable. Under pressure from both Edward Collins and the American government, who was subsidizing the Collins line, ship's masters were required to operate at maximum speed at all times, or at least as much as possible. The captains knew how serious this was, and a late arrival might very well cost them their jobs. By September 27th, the Arctic had reached the Grand Banks, about 60 miles southeast of Newfoundland. This area of the North Atlantic is characterized by the intersection of the cold south-moving Labrador Current and the warmer northerly Gulf Stream. The result is frequent and often dense fog and mist, not to mention rough seas. Captain Luce, being an experienced mariner who knew these waters well, ordered lookouts to carefully watch for other ships. Ideally, he would have slowed to roughly half speed in such dense fog, and it is certain this is what he preferred to do. But his orders were clear: full steam ahead, at all costs. Just after midday, a lookout spotted a ship bursting out of the fog at full steam and full sail at approximately 8 knots off the Arctic's starboard bow. This was the French fishing vessel Vesta, which had departed St. Pierre Island the prior day, bound for Granville, France. She was transporting French fishermen back to France from Canada as it was the end of the summer fishing season. The Vesta was an iron vessel with steam-powered propeller propulsion, 2 masts for sails, and carried 147 passengers and about 50 crew. It was much smaller than the Arctic, at only 250 tons and just half its length. She also had watertight bulkheads, an uncommon feature at the time. Standard procedure would call for a port-to-port passing, meaning both ships should have turned their ships to the right. The officer of the watch on the Arctic bellowed, "Hard a starboard," which is called a tiller command, and actually means turn the ship to port, or to the left. He deemed, in this situation, the only reasonable way of avoiding collision was to turn the ship to port. But Captain Alphonse Duchesne of the Vesta, in a sort of guessing game, assumed a standard port-to-port passing would occur, and he ordered his ship turned to starboard. The result of these maneuvers brought the Arctic across the bow of the Vesta as it passed, and the Vesta turned directly into the new course of the Arctic. An illustrated map of these decisions and the routes of the two ships can be found on Shipwrecks and SeaDogs.com on this episode's page. Arctic's engines were cut and then ordered to full astern. The Vesta also ordered full astern as collision was imminent, but it was too late. The Vesta slammed into the starboard bow of the Arctic, smashing the Vesta's bow inward and tearing away at the Arctic's wooden hull. The jagged iron of the Vesta's crumpled bow impaled one of the crew, causing him to scream in agony. Others suffered broken limbs, cuts, and bruises as they were jostled about in the wreckage, slipping on the blood-soaked deck. As the Arctic was much larger than the Vesta, it was barely a bump in the road for her. But the Vesta's bow became a crumpled mass of iron and wood, and her foremast was snapped. As the Arctic steamed ahead, the Vesta scraped and tore down the Arctic's wooden hull, scraping away at her timbers and starboard side paddle wheel. As the two ships broke free from each other, the Vesta was spun around and was severely damaged. Her bow was crushed and underwater. On the Vesta, it was truly a scene of carnage as panic swept over the ship. Crew and passengers alike screamed in horror, begging for the Arctic to stop and help. Water was pouring into the hull from the bow, and it appeared to have only minutes before it would go down. In desperation, 12 crewmen of the Vesta launched a lifeboat in order to reach the safety of the Arctic. Captain Duchesne shouted orders for the men to stop immediately in return. But their instinct to survive at any cost overrode any commands of their captain, and they rowed frantically toward the Arctic. This would not only prove to be a bad decision, but also a sign of things to come. Officers on the Arctic quickly examined the damage to their ship, and it was determined to be all above the waterline, and the ship was not in danger of sinking. They were only 50 miles from Newfoundland, and it was believed they could easily make it to shore. With this information, Captain Luce ordered the engines to be re-engaged, and he turned his attention to the Vesta. Seeing the Vesta's bow underwater, he ordered the Arctic to begin a slow turn in order to assist the stricken vessel. Luce ordered 2 of the lifeboats to be launched by Chief Officer Gorley and Second Officer Ballum. Gorley boarded his lifeboat with 2 other men, lowered it into the water, and started for the Vesta. Ballum had difficulty getting his boat into the water and didn't launch. As this was occurring, Captain Luce ordered an additional inspection of the Arctic's damage. After this second inspection, large holes were discovered below the waterline, and the ship was filling with water. The Arctic did not have watertight bulkheads, so the water dispersed throughout the hull. With this news, Luce ordered the holes to be plugged with cargo and mattresses. However, this section of the ship was already underwater, and plugging it was now impossible. The crew tried to use a canvas sail to cover the holes from the outside, but the jagged and splintered wood of the hull ripped the canvas apart. All efforts to stop the flow of water failed. Captain Luce now knew the ship was going to sink, and the only hope was to steam northwest for Newfoundland. He ordered Second Officer Ballum to stop his attempt at launching his lifeboat and for his men to call for Gorley to return. But Gorley's lifeboat had already disappeared into the fog, and he could not be reached. Trusting Gorley could navigate his way to safety, he ordered the Arctic full ahead. It was 4 hours to Newfoundland, and it would mean he had to abandon the struggling Vesta, but it was the only hope to save his ship and the lives of those on board. Captain Luce was not aware that a lifeboat from the Vesta had been launched, and it had just pulled aside the Arctic, 4 of the starboard paddle wheel. As the ship changed course and started ahead for Newfoundland, the lifeboat from the Vesta was pulled alongside the Arctic just in front of the paddle wheel. The lifeboat bumped and foundered against the side of the ship until being smashed under the churning paddle wheel. The boat splintered into oblivion. The men in the boat were crushed and ripped to pieces by the paddle wheel until their remains fell free. Only one man survived, and he was pulled on board the Arctic. The sight of this massacre must have been horrific for the passengers, who were at this time crowding along the starboard railing to watch the events unfold. To decrease the list to starboard, Luce ordered all passengers to the port side, and the crew dragged the anchor over to the port side as well. The starboard side lifted up, reducing the amount of water entering the ship. For a brief time, the ship was actually somewhat stable, and there was some hope, if not guarded. A ship's carpenter built a makeshift scaffolding and made attempts at repairing the damaged hull, only to limited effect. The ship's boilers were under tremendous stress as the ship was low in the water and the paddle wheel struggled to churn through the seas. The boilers caught fire, and the ship came to a complete stop. The engine room crew attempted to abandon their posts but were convinced to return, as reaching Newfoundland was their only hope. With the rising water level inside the ship, the fires were soon extinguished, but it was hardly any good news. The water was now too high for the bilge pumps to operate properly. With only 5 lifeboats remaining, there was enough space for about 150 people, far short of accommodating all on board, as was usual for this time. Captain Luce ordered lifeboats to be readied, with women and children boarding first. The aft starboard lifeboat that Second Officer Ballum had tried to launch previously was loaded with women, children, and provisions and put under the command of the ship's butcher. Captain Luce ordered the lifeboats lowered part way, and then to wait for other lifeboats to be lowered so they could all stay together and pick up any survivors from the water. The lifeboat was lowered, but orders were ignored, and the boat launched into the sea and began rowing away. Luce shouted for them to stand by, but the butcher in command had no care to listen to logic and selfishly rowed away. As if a switch had been engaged, panic and chaos engulfed the ship. Many passengers and crew members began forcing themselves toward the lifeboats, even shoving women and children out of the way. Another lifeboat that was partially filled with women and children was rushed by these men. They forced themselves on board while men who still had their wits about them, some armed with axes, tried to stop them. During the fray, the lifeboat was toppled over, and all aboard, including 5 male crew members, fell into the sea and drowned. Captain Luce desperately tried to regain order. The ship's quartermasters were armed to dissuade further mutiny. Luce shouted orders to his crew, but many of them had already abandoned their posts, trying to reach a lifeboat at all costs. Meanwhile, a young engineer in training named Stuart Holland was posted to the ship's signal cannon. Holland unwaveringly fired off his cannon at 1-minute intervals, refusing to leave his post. Second Officer Ballum had managed to load another lifeboat with some women and children, but mostly crew. Even worse, the boat was only at about half its capacity. Later, he wrote of this. "I went to the starboard and ordered the guard boat to be lowered. I asked the captain what his intentions were, and he replied, 'The fate of the ship is mine.' I then asked if he would not allow his son to go with me, and he answered that he should share my fate. I then jumped into the boat and was ordered by the captain to cut away. About 20 people jumped overboard. Of these, 17 or 18 were picked up. We fell in with another boat, which had been lowered from the other side, and lightened her of part of her complement, leaving 19 on her and 26 in mine. But Ballum ignored orders and did not wait for other lifeboats or survivors after the Arctic went down. He rowed away, abandoning the ship and his captain. Meanwhile, manual hand pumps were being operated by crew and passengers alike. This was exhausting work, as they cranked until their hands bled. Captain Luce spotted a passenger, a woman, who was cranking the manual pumps as blood ran down her arms and onto the deck. He told her it was no use, the pumps were not working, and she might as well give up. But she refused. No matter their efforts, the amount of water gushing into the ship was simply too massive for the hand pumps to make any impact. The Arctic was at a standstill and slowly sinking. Terror overcame the remaining passengers and crew. Captain Luce had an armed showdown with one of his own men when a crazed sailor came at him with a knife. Luce grabbed a mallet and was able to fend him off. Some of the men looted the ship's stores, helping themselves to liquor and wine, drinking themselves into a stupor. Others had more malicious plans. In a disgusting and shameful moment, women were assaulted sexually. I won't dwell on the details. Other, more noble men on board did everything they could to put a stop to this brutality. A group of the ship's engineers pushed their way into another lifeboat, claiming they were attempting to make repairs. Anyone who stood in their way was threatened with firearms. They loaded a lifeboat, taking pistols and provisions with them, and launched. They quickly rowed away, not even stopping for nearby people in the water, and with the lifeboat only half filled. Captain Luce was left with only 2 officers on board. All others had disappeared, already died, or abandoned the ship. Another lifeboat was rushed by men, only for the boat and the men to fall into the sea. The lifeboat drifted off, empty, into the fog. With only 1 lifeboat remaining, Captain Luce ordered wood from the yardarms and other parts of the ship to be used for a makeshift raft. This would allow as many people as possible to have something to hold onto when they entered the water. 4th Officer Francis Dorian launched the remaining lifeboat, and he and his men began piecing together the odds and ends of timbers into a crude raft. As work continued, more and more men began pushing their way toward the raft. At this time, the ship's alarm was sounded, signaling the ship was sinking. Armed men with axes tried to prevent unruly crew and passengers from boarding the raft. A melee erupted as women and children were shoved aside. Men began jumping overboard and joined Dorian in the lifeboat. Others grasped at the planks of the still unfinished raft. One of the men who made it to Dorian's boat was fireman Patrick Tobin. In later testimony, Tobin said, "It was every man for himself. No more attention was paid to the captain than to any other man on board. Life was as sweet to us as to others." The lifeboat was in danger of being swamped as men grasped at sides to get aboard. Dorian had no choice but to cut the lifeboat free and drift away from the Arctic. For those still on board, all hope of safely evacuating was lost. The ship was sinking, and all 6 lifeboats had already launched and rowed away. Acknowledging this reality, Captain Luce had lifebelts distributed to as many as possible, and gave instructions to stay together once in the water. Some huddled together on deck, sobbing, and fearfully waited. Others sang hymns and read scripture. The more frantic ran about the ship grabbing anything that might float, such as doors, chairs, and sofas. Still, others continued their drunken debauchery. When there was no more to be done, Captain Luce retrieved his son Willie from his cabin and brought him to the top of the starboard paddle box. There they stayed as they waited for the ocean to take his ship. As the Arctic groaned and pitched, shouts of horror erupted from the 250 or so still on board. Paul Gann, who was in Francis Dorian's lifeboat, lamented, "I heard one fearful shriek and saw the passengers swept forward against the smokestack, and then all was over." At 4:45 p.m., 27th of September, 1854, 4.5 hours after the collision with the Vesta, the Arctic was no more. Throughout these hours, Stuart Holland remained at his post and diligently fired his signal cannon. One last cannon blast was heard just moments before the ship went down. Holland remained at his post, loyal to the end, and went down with the ship. Captain Luce and Willie were dragged under by the suction of the sinking ship, but were able to resurface. Luce spotted his boy in the water and swam to him. In a later statement, Captain Luce described this frightful experience. "A most awful and heart-rending scene presented itself to my view. Over 200 men, women, and children struggling together amidst pieces of wreck of every kind, calling on each other for help, and imploring God to assist them. Such an appalling scene may God preserve me from ever witnessing again. Just then, one of the ship's paddle boxes suddenly rushed up from the depths and popped up through the surface, striking young Willie squarely in the head and killing him. Captain Luce received a hefty blow as well, but was able to recover. He held his son's limp body one last time before climbing on top of the paddle box with 11 others. Those now in the water tried desperately to hold on to the raft as it jostled against the hull of the ship, throwing a good many into the sea. About 70 or so people clung to the raft as it drifted away from the ship and into the fog. Peter McCabe, a waiter who happened to be on his first transatlantic voyage, described what he saw. Several persons were floating about on doors and beds. I seized hold of a door which had been taken down to save passengers and went into the sea, where I left the door and got upon the raft. A great many persons were trying to get on the raft. Among the number who were on it, I saw 4 ladies. The captain and his small group of survivors drifted on top of the paddle box, knee-deep in frigid water, with waves frequently crashing on top of them. As dawn broke, the fog was heavy, and only 7 were remaining, including James Luce. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and thirst took their toll throughout the day, and they wondered if they would live to see another hour, let alone another day. By nightfall, only Captain Luce, George A. Allen, and a young man remained on their raft. Just before daybreak of their 3rd day adrift, they spotted the light of an oncoming vessel. Mustering up the little energy they had, the 3 men did all they could for about 15 minutes until the vessel disappeared into the fog. Disappointed, they collapsed in exhaustion. Another glimmer of hope appeared shortly after daybreak when they spotted a bark approaching, but it too failed to see them and sailed off. The forlorn men settled in for another miserable day adrift, fighting through exhaustion and hunger. Miraculously, at 3:00 p.m., a ship rapidly approached their raft. It was the sailing vessel Cambria, from Glasgow. Earlier that day, Cambria picked up François Gessonnet, the lone survivor from the Vesta's lifeboat, who avoided being crushed under the Arctic's paddle wheel. Gessonnet informed Captain John Russell of the Arctic's demise, and the survivors in the water. Captain Russell had previously been the commander of the Jesse Stevens, which sank in 1852. Russell was rescued by the Arctic sister ship Pacific, and he was now returning the favor. Captain Luce and the 2 other men were taken on board, finally ending their ordeal. The Cambria then continued searching the surrounding waters, rescuing a total of 9 survivors before heading to Newfoundland. Captain Luce wrote of his rescue. Of Captain Russell, it would scarcely be possible to say enough in his praise for the kind treatment we, every one of us, have received from him during the time we have been on board his ship. His own comforts he gave up, in every respect, for our relief. The Reverend Mr. Walker and lady, and another gentleman who were passengers by the Cambria, have been unceasing in their endeavors to promote our comfort. To them and to all on board, we shall ever owe a debt of gratitude for their unbounded kindness to us. The Canadian bark Huron came upon Francis Dorian's lifeboat on the 28th, a day after the sinking. The lifeboat contained 26 crew members and 5 passengers, all of them men. The Huron also picked up Peter McCabe, the only survivor of the makeshift raft that started out with about 70 passengers. The next day, the Huron encountered the sailing vessel Lebanon, bound for New York. Francis Dorian, 5 passengers, and 12 of the crew decided to board the Lebanon and return to New York. The remaining crew chose to stay on the Cambria and continue on to Canada, perhaps fearing the consequences of their conduct. Second Officer Balaam, after abandoning the Arctic in his lifeboat, took his men straight toward Newfoundland. He successfully navigated using dead reckoning and made it to shore on the morning of September 29th. The Arctic's purser, a man named John Geeb, sent a short message by courier to the American consul in St. John's, reporting the accident. Balaam then hired 2 schooners, leading one of them to search for survivors, and the other schooner took the remaining men to St. John's. After 3 days of searching and finding nothing, Balaam returned to St. John's to rejoin his men. There, he was shocked to discover the Vesta. The ship's bow was completely demolished, but the watertight bulkheads worked as designed and helped stabilize the ship, just enough for her to limp back to Newfoundland. Those on the Vesta had already provided their account of what had occurred, and it was printed in the Patriot and Terra Nova Herald newspaper in St. John's. It wasn't entirely accurate. Not knowing the Arctic had sunk, their reports indicated the Arctic had smashed into them and then steamed away without providing assistance. Because of this, the crew of the Arctic were treated very coldly and with disdain. The first of the 3 rescue ships to make it to shore was the Lebanon, making it to New York on October 11th. The accounts of the survivors were the first news of this horrible tragedy, and it kicked off a media frenzy. Their story was incomplete as well, as they had no knowledge of the safe return of the Vesta, and they believed Captain Luce to be lost. Balaam's report was received by telegraph from Halifax later that same day, and a more complete picture was coming into view. The Huron arrived in Newfoundland on October 13th, and the Cambria just a few hours later. Upon arrival of the Cambria, Captain Luce sent a heartfelt and personal note to Edward Collins, informing his boss of the loss of the Arctic, as well as his own wife and 2 children. This message was received by Collins on October 13th. You heard a portion of this note in the opening of this episode. This message concluded with the following. I have safely arrived at Quebec, and I am left without a penny in the world with which to help myself. With sincere gratitude to those from whom I have received such unbounded kindness since I have been providently thrown amongst them, I am about to separate to go to New York, a home of sorrow. I learned from the doctor at quarantine last evening that the Vesta had reached St. John's with several passengers from the Arctic, but could not learn the particulars. As soon as I can get on shore, I shall make arrangements to leave for New York with the least possible delay. I take the steamer for Montreal this afternoon. I am, very respectfully, your obedient servant, James Luce. As more reports trickled in over the coming weeks, the public was made aware of the shameful and disgraceful behavior of the Arctic's crew members. Paul Gran, who was on Francis Dorian's boat, told the New York Times, all order and discipline ceased on board, and that Chief Engineer J.W. Rogers had threatened passengers with firearms. The Times described the situation as a ghastly desertion of duty, and derided the cowardly and dastardly conduct of the crew. Some of the crew who landed in Canada chose to permanently stay, rather than face the media in public back in New York. Demands were made for an investigation, but none were initiated. Perhaps this was the desire of Edward Collins, who could make problems go away if he wished. No crimes were looked into, and nobody was held liable for their actions. James Luce was largely exonerated of any wrongdoing, and generally he was considered a hero. Although some criticism was placed on him later, by all accounts he did what he could, and never once tried to save himself or board a lifeboat. What was stunning to the general public was this. In total, 3 lifeboats carried 24 male passengers and approximately 64 members of the crew. Not a single woman or child survived, causing a public outrage. Modern estimates put the number of dead between 275 and 350. But precise records were not kept, and it is impossible to know the exact number. Included among the dead were the wife and 2 children of Edward Collins, all 6 members of the Brown banking family, and the French diplomat, the Duc de Gramont. One of the survivors was a passenger named Thomas Fleury. He was considered to be dead until 1860, when he shockingly came forward as one of the survivors. According to Fleury, he was picked up by a whaling ship, but when it also sank, he was forced to shelter on a small island. He was eventually rescued by another whaling ship and subsequently returned to New York. After surviving 2 shipwrecks and taking 6 years to return home, he discovered his wife had remarried. Captain Luce never again returned to the sea. He later regretted abandoning First Officer Gorley, believing Gorley could have helped him maintain better control over the crew. Luce served as an inspector for the Great Western Marine Insurance Company until his death in 1879. The Collins Line again experienced tragedy when the SS Pacific disappeared in 1856 while en route to New York from Liverpool. The ship and all those on board were never seen again. The Collins Line filed for bankruptcy and ceased operations in 1858. After the sinking of the Arctic, some maritime practices became more common, including using red and green running lights, watertight bulkheads, and steam whistles. In 1855, at least in part in response to the Arctic tragedy, Matthew Fontaine Murray, who is called the father of oceanography, published his book Sailing Directions. In it, he detailed a plan for parallel sea lanes to be followed, with westward ships using the northerly lane and eastward ships staying to the south. This plan was adopted by many shipping companies in the coming years and decades. The New York Times published a plea to require lifeboats for all, but that change would not take place for another 60 years after the sinking of the Titanic. A monument to Willie Luce was erected at Center Cemetery at Wareham, Massachusetts, next to the grave of Captain James Luce. In 1860, James Brown of the Brown banking family commissioned a monument at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn to memorialize his 6 family members who were lost on the Arctic. The monument features a sculpture of the Arctic as she was sinking. The remarkably resilient Vesta was repaired and sailed for France in 1855. It was sold to French shipping giant Compagnie Générale Maritime. After being sold a number of times more, she was renamed Amberes in 1863, serving as a freighter between Spain and Belgium. In 1875, she sank in Santander Harbor off the coast of northern Spain. The wreck of the SS Arctic has never been found. It lies somewhere on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, over 50 miles southeast of Cape Race, in about 485 feet of water. That's going to do it for the story of the SS Arctic. Thank you so much for listening. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, and also on Mastodon at shipwreckspod@sea.im. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Please remember, if you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review, and tell a friend. Please join me again in 2 weeks, and until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.